Buenos días a todos, soy Leo Teti, el editor de Umbriel, que es el sello de ficción adulta de Ediciones Urano, y hoy tengo una invitada súper especial, que es Bridget Collins, la autora de La traición de Montverre. How are you, Bridget?
I'm very good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you for joining us. We are very excited about this wonderful book that we are all in love with this story and with your writing, which is amazing. So let's start with the basics. How did you turn out to be a writer?
Well, when I was a kid, I always wanted to be an actor. And so I went to university and then I went to drama school, and I was always really, really focused on that. But my mother was a writer, so because she had been a writer, it had always struck me as a kind of completely unglamorous thing to do. So I wasn't really interested in doing it as a career, but what it meant was that I would always, if I was bored or something, I'd always kind of think, oh, I could write a story or I could write a poem or something. So it was always kind of in the background. And what that meant was that when I came to the end of drama school and then I was unemployed, as so many people are after drama school. And it was then that I realized that, I could do this creative thing to stay sane. And because of the way the creative process worked, I could do the creative bit before, trying to do anything else with it, which of course was a kind of mirror image of what it was like being an actor. So basically I started writing then, and it just kept me sane. And because I loved doing it, I carried on doing it. And then the acting kind of went on a back burner. And so I just sort of fell into being a writer that way.
Okay, that is very, very cool. And there is something about you that I feel identified with. At some point, I started working as a young adult fiction editor, and you started as a YA author. And now I am in charge of this adult imprint that my idea is like to build a bridge between the YA audience and the adult audience. Because the people of my age who started reading with Harry Potter, the Hunger Games, whatever, now are reading like adult stuff, So how was this change of starting writing young adult fiction and then turning into the adult world?
I think, it's been amazingly liberating for me. In some ways, it's just very nice to have had a kind of first career that's separate, because what that means is that, I learned a lot doing that. And so when the binding was published and it was really successful, and I think if that had been my actual debut rather than just my adult debut, then I think I would have just taken it all for granted. Whereas because I'd had a career publishing books before in a different field, it was really useful to know that, this doesn't happen every time, and to know how lucky I was. So there's that. But I think also, I think I started writing for young adults for various reasons, but the biggest one, I think, was that at that time, 10, 15 years ago, it was the only genre where you could write the sort of books that I wanted to write and be taken seriously. So, that kind of combination of realism and magic, which is in the binding and to a lesser degree, but still there, I think, in the betrayals, that you couldn't really do in the adult market. So what happened was I ended up writing for young adults because those were the books I wanted to write. And then I was really lucky that as I carried on, the market changed, and suddenly I kind of, hit this sweet spot where the book I wanted to write, which was really a book for me, for a 35-year-old as I was, suddenly that was acceptable in the adult market, and I could kind of make that transition. And, I love writing for young adults. I think there's an immediacy and a kind of intensity about it, which is really exhilarating. And I think some of that, is in the binding. People have said to me, oh, it's very young adult. And I think what they mean is that, it wears its heart on its sleeve. And that's something that I really like as a reader. But also, as well as that, I love writing adult books because finally I can write for me in a slightly more authentic way, because obviously before I was kind of trying to adjust. I was trying to take 10 years off my age. And so now I think, I can pour my whole self into writing for adults in a way that maybe I couldn't quite previously.
Okay, that's very interesting. And you brought up something that for me is like very characteristic of your kind of writing, this magical stuff, because it was very tricky for us to catalog the book because it's like not the typical novel, you know. You are like all the time like in the border, the same as the binding. I mean, I love the binding, I love that book, and I love this one too. And your atmosphere and the way you create the scenario, the characters, it's like right in the middle, you know, of real world and magic. What about you? I mean, what about it?
Well, I mean, you're right. It is really hard to categorize. You know, people ask me, they say, what sort of book is it? And, you know, for the binding, I say, well, it's sort of magical realism in a historical sort of way. You know, they say, oh, you mean it's fantasy? And I'm like, well, it's not quite fantasy either. And I think The Betrayals is actually even harder to categorize because it's sort of alternative historical fiction. You know, it's not magical. There's nothing supernatural going on, except I suppose there's kind of religious stuff, sort of, but that's, you know, it's very much in a sort of realistic milieu in terms of, you know, the religion is not presented as a supernatural thing, but obviously it's set in an imaginary country playing this imaginary game, and so the whole thing is predicated on unfamiliarity. So yeah, I don't know.
Okay,
I suppose.
No, but I mean, it's amazing to find authors like you, because I mean, it's like you are all the time like guessing what you're reading. I mean, even with this book, I was like, okay, this is historical, but this is not. It's amazing. I mean, I really like, because this is like a challenging reading, you know. Even maybe at the beginning, you are like not totally sure of what is going on, and then it's, oh my God, this is really happening. You know, it's like all the reactions that and all the experience that you have throughout the book is amazing, and it's something that I have been reading in a lot of reviews. The development, I mean, they talk about the development of the story and all the reading experience with the betrayals.
Yes, I mean, I think it's interesting what you identify there, that, you know, actually the world kind of unfolds slowly in some ways because the world isn't the point. You know, the world is a way of telling the story, and for me, the heart of the story is about the relationships and the emotions. So, you know, what I want, I suppose, is that sense of a kind of infinite and ideally infinitely interesting background to something actually very immediate and emotional. And you know, I'm the kind of reader that, you know, I'm sort of interested in world building, and I'll kind of skim that. But basically, what I want to know is, you know, do they fall in love, and if so, do they get together? You know, you know, there's something, you know, I think atmosphere and setting, you know, is wonderful. You need that kind of evocative ambience in a book, but actually what you need most of all is the emotional heart of it.
Yeah, definitely, I agree. So I mean, for those who haven't read the book yet, what can you tell in terms of the story without the spoilers, and also the inspiration behind this book?
So well, the Betrayals, as it's called in English, although it's in Spanish, it's the tradition of Montverre. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Which is lovely, actually. I really like that as well. So it's set in an alternative country, European probably. So in my head, it's kind of between, you know, sort of, it's kind of the eastern third of France, so sort of where Burgundy, the old kingdom of Burgundy used to be. And it's set in a school where people study a game called the Grand Jeu, which is a kind of mysterious combination of music and maths and philosophy and poetry and sort of all of human wisdom, basically. And the main characters, well, probably the main character has been a politician, and it's inspired by the sort of rise of fascism in the 1930s. He's been part of this government, which is obviously quite sinister, and has finally spoken up and has been exiled to this school where he was a student 10 years ago. And there he kind of comes into contact with the first female Magister Ludi, who is basically the head of the game within the school. And when he meets her, he begins to realize that he has this mysterious connection with her. And through the course of the book, obviously you find out what that connection is, but it kind of goes back 10 years to when he was a student there, and a tragedy that occurred when he was a student. So it's sort of, I guess it's a book about, identity and about artistic rivalry and ambition. But it's also about love, because obviously it has to be.
Yes, love is always present in like all the stories, there is different kind of loves, but love is always present there.
Exactly.
And what was the most challenging part of writing the betrayals?
Well, I think one of the things that happened was between my first and second draft. So the process was that I sent the first draft to my agent, and she got back to me with notes. And one of the things she said was, there's a strand here which isn't working. I think there needs to be more of it. So I added probably about a third of the book again, kind of expanding this strand into something a bit more, kind of meatier and more interesting. And then that was the draft we sent to my editor at the publisher, and she looked at it and she was like, oh, there's too much of this strand. So I had to take out another third. And so it was, I think one of the hardest things basically was finding that sort of balance and sweet spot between the different voices and the different narratives. So, I wanted it to be a kind of ambitious, multi-voiced book. And partly because there's a thematic thing, I wanted the kind of multiple voices, because there's a discussion of music, and music is kind of a theme, and the idea of these different voices fitting into the pattern was kind of important. But as I did it, I realized that is really hard, and finding the rhythm and the plot development using that kind of scattergun approach was something that, obviously with the binding, which is much more linear, I hadn't done before. So that was probably the big thing, was kind of orchestrating it with all the different narratives coming in.
Okay, but the result is amazing. You succeed in doing this, because the result is amazing. And Bridget, now a question that is more personal in a way. How do you deal like being a well-known actor, living in 2022 with social media, with everything happening like in front of you in a screen? How is your relationship with your readers? The binding was published in many languages. This one is also still being published around the world. How do you feel, having people from Latin America, from, Italy, from around the world reaching out saying, okay, I read your book, in another language even, no? Because you wrote it in English and people are reading the book in other languages.
Well, it's lovely. It's kind of surreal, I think. And it's a strange sort of feeling. I think as a writer, basically what you want, the nicest thing is to know that somebody has read your book and that it's meant something to them. And that is, that's the Holy Grail. So when people get in touch and they say this meant so much to me, it's lovely, and it doesn't stop being lovely. Every time you hear it, it's like, oh, I'm so glad. And that, that's sometimes just what keeps you going. If I'm on Twitter and somebody messages me and says, I loved your book, and if I'm in the middle of a difficult time writing, which I probably am if I'm on Twitter, that can kind of power me up to go back to my writing, and it's lovely. So I think, that on the whole, it's absolutely wonderful. It's slightly, oddly, I think there's sometimes a kind of feeling of vulnerability, because, when you write, you're writing sort of for readers in the future, but mainly you're writing for you, and you feel invisible. You feel as if you've got nothing to lose. And my teen books, because they didn't sell very well and not many people read them, I kind of kept that with me, that I felt completely invisible, and it didn't matter what I did or what I said, and nobody would care. And mostly that's a bad feeling. If what you want is to put your creativity out into the world, feeling like you're invisible is not a good thing. But there's a freedom that goes with it. So when you realize that actually people might know your name or something, then suddenly you feel you have to be more careful. And so, and I mean that sort of artistically as well as personally. I mean that when you're writing, if you think nobody's ever going to read it, you can absolutely write from the heart in an authentic way. And as soon as you start thinking, oh, will the people who liked the binding like this, or will the people who like the betrayals like this, or as soon as you start that second guessing, then you're moving away from that kind of pure place, which is where you need to write from. then again, I mean, you know, if you're a writer, people aren't going to recognize you in the street. You know, there's only a certain level of well-knownness you can get. So I think, you know, it's nowhere near the pressure that you would get if you were an actor or something, because, you know, basically, you know, I have to get very famous before anybody really cared what I said of it.
I know. And then, I mean, what was like the main difference between the writing process of The Binding and this book that is right after? I mean, in terms of pressure, editorial process, what is the main difference there?
Well, there was more pressure on The Betrayals, but actually because of the timing, it wasn't huge. So I'd already started, I'd already got the idea for The Betrayals before we sold The Binding. Okay. So it was one of the things that we talked about in the auction meetings for The Binding, was sort of what I was writing next. And actually the idea for The Betrayals, I had to, you know, my agent sort of said, so what are you writing next? I was like, well, I've got no idea. So I sort of dashed something off on the back of an envelope. And then as I talked about it in the meetings, I was like, oh, wait, this is a really good idea. I like this. And it was actually, you know, that was part of the process. So I was writing The Betrayals while they were gearing up for the publication of The Binding. And I think it was all but finished by the time The Binding came out and became a bestseller. Okay. So that was great. You know, I was in that wonderful, you know, that sort of halcyon period where you know that the publisher is really excited about your book and everything feels really positive, but you haven't hit the moment of, will it be successful or won't it? So it, you know, that's kind of the nicest possible moment to be writing a new book. And actually what I've found is that the kind of aftermath of The Binding and The Betrayals being successful, where I think, oh God, is the next one going to be as good? That's kind of hit the third one, actually. So it's taken me, I mean, to be fair, I have also had a baby and there's been the pandemic, so it's taken me longer to write the third book. And I think maybe there's been a bit more anxiety going into that one. But as I say, I think this is another moment where having had that kind of previous career has really helped me, because having written, you know, 7 books, you know, I knew I could write a book, you know, I knew I could sit down and write something. And it sort of wasn't a second book in quite the same way, because it wasn't, you know, I was writing my second adult book, but it wasn't the second book. I'd kind of got through that, you know, the hard second album was, you know, I'd moment already.
Okay, and talking about a third book, I mean, can you share anything or not yet? I mean, about what is coming?
Yeah, I hope so. I've just sent the manuscript, the edited manuscript off to my agent. So if she likes it, then hopefully it won't change massively. So it's set in a kind of, it's basically Victorian, 19th century, and it's about a factory in the west of England which uses spider silk to spin a fabric that makes silence. So it's, you know, and there's a young man who's recently been bereaved, and he kind of goes down and to visit the man who owns the factory and his deaf daughter, and then gets kind of sucked in to marketing the silk and trying to make it a big thing in the world, and then slowly comes to realize that actually it's in many ways it's quite sinister. So it's, you know, I think it's like The Binding in that it's got this sort of central metaphor which is about, you know, silence and, you know, what we do with things that are superficially very attractive, and then we realize that there are dangers associated with them. But it's also, again, like The Binding, again, it's a love story, and it's about that kind of emotional progression of in his case, he's kind of coming back to life after having been bereaved.
Okay, I really like it. I need to read it now.
Okay, that's the ideal response.
Okay, Bridget, like a last question to close this interview that, in fact, is amazing to chat with you. I mean, you are very passionate about what you do, and it's incredible, like, to meet authors who, and something that I really like, and everyone here in the publishing house about your book is you are not a formula author, you know? I mean, you take risks when you write, and that is amazing to come up with books like this one, which is like, I mean, That's amazing. So, I mean, my last question, who are your influence? I mean, authors, books, I mean, key books or authors in your life?
I think, who do I always cite? There are people, I think, like Daphne du Maurier, who really speak to me. And I've thought a lot about why I pick on her. And I think there's something about, that hitting that sweet spot of being literary and kind of utterly immersive, so that it's a world you can immerse yourself in, but also it's saying, it's telling some sort of fundamental truth about the world and about relationships. And then people like Sarah Waters, I love because of that. I mean, I think in some ways that's the same, that she's creating these kind of wonderful immersive worlds and then doing something very interesting within them. So yes, I think, and then I think there are people I admire who I could never quite be like, who are people like Rosamund Lehman, who was a writer in the sort of 20s and 30s, and she writes these very sort of feminine, meditative, evocative love stories, and there's something, there's some quality about that I always try to get into my books somewhere. They're never going to be the same sorts of books, but sometimes that can be the most inspiring, when there's just an element of somebody that you're trying to recreate and probably failing, but so yeah, I think those are the people who are influencing most who are influencing me at the moment.
Okay, it has been amazing to chat with you, Bridget. Thank you very much for your time, and I mean, we will meet again in your next book. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Okay, take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.